It's what keeps humans alive. We're a storytelling animal, and I grew up in places with very little media, you know, pre-television, radio reception, so dodgy you never got it at night, no newspapers, all of that sort of thing. And so we relied on story, and I just thought that's how families worked. I thought my uncles and my father were the best storytellers going around, except for my auntie. My auntie Faith told the best story in the world, and I just followed her wherever I could. Oh, well, I'm a book person. I just love libraries because of the books. It's my early memories were, I lived in the bush, so we didn't have any books, and when I figured that you could go to one place and see a whole lot of books, I just couldn't stay away. I went to libraries all over the place, museums and libraries, and you know, I've got deep affection for some of the places I've been because I found things there, thanks to librarians, that opened up or validated a point that I knew was going to be really telling, and so I'm deeply grateful to the repository. There's a story that deeply affected me when I heard it read at school. It was by the American writer Ambrose Bierce. I think it's called Rider in the Sky. It's about the American Civil War and the stupidity of war. And I'm writing a novel now about the stupidity of war. So I reference Rider in the Sky in my brain, not in the book. William Faulkner, anything William Faulkner wrote, really, I think is marvellous. But John Steinbeck, Kath Walker, and now Alexis Wright, Kim Scott, you know, they're just wonderful storytellers. I know there's more than three. I write because I read, and like I said before, we're the storytelling animal. That is what we do. That is how we make sense of ourselves and our world. And our moral code is written in words. We make law out of writing. You know, parliaments make law out of gobbledygook, but the people make law out of literature. You know, like the statement from Uluru. You know, when you read that, it's beautifully written. And like the Redfern speech, it'll be known as a moment in Australian history that was really important. It's because there was a wordsmith behind it. There was someone who could actually write. There was someone there whose intention was not to bore the audience to death. The first one was about ghosts. You know, I was probably 16 or 17. I wrote a lot of poetry before that, I still do. But this one was about, I was living in the country and someone told me this ghost story about having seen what they thought was a ghost. And I wrote the story, but it was actually his brother, up to no good. And so what he'd actually seen wasn't a ghost, it was his brother being ghost-like. And badly written. It's burnt now. Very early, you know, I think it was listening to Only Faith, you know, I was so entranced, and I was reading novels at the same time, and it suddenly struck me they're the same thing. What she was doing was telling a story that could be written. And I've written some of her stories. I've stolen from her. And so gradually I got this idea that I might be a writer. And I remember one day in the library at Melbourne University where I was bored to tears and hiding in the library, having failed to go to a lecture that I just couldn't bring myself to go to. And I was flicking through the library and I was reading the Boree log by ostensibly a famous Australian writer. I think it was Bancroft Boak. And I thought, this is shit. I can do better than this, you know. So from that point, I virtually wrote every day. There's no difference. I've seen many times Aboriginal people telling a story, and I've seen them edit themselves during the story, you know, because I've heard the story a number of times. And you can see them form the story better, you know, articulate it in a more rhythmic pattern. You know, that's editing. So it's no different to a written story. You know, a story can be enhanced by the human voice and the human passion. But I think a good writer can make sure that that voice and passion are in the story. And so I don't really think there's a difference. And 2 nights ago, I'd worked hard all day and I went down to the river with 2 cans of beer, but only for my health, you understand. And I sat on the riverbank. And, you know, I was really enjoying the beer and I was really enjoying sitting down, not working. And I reckon, and it was just after we'd had a lot of rain over 3 or 4 days, so the birds were out and about. They were enjoying themselves in the last of the light of that day. And I was just entranced by the conversation that was going on. And what I noticed was the birds were waiting for each other to finish their song before they'd sing theirs. Because they wanted to communicate with their fellows, so they'd have to wait for the magpie to shut up, and they'd slide in, and then the mudlark would wait for them to stop. And there was this brilliant conversation, this brilliant story going on, and it was rhythmic. You could feel the rhythm of it. And you know, the last bird to call is the kookaburra. The first bird to call is the kookaburra, the last bird to call is the kookaburra. And it was just like punctuation. That'll do, that's it. Good night. All we ask is that if non-Indigenous writers are going to write about Indigenous people or events, that they do so after having had a conversation with Indigenous people, and not just one person. To, you know, have repeated conversations, which means that you end up having cups of tea, sharing scones, learning the name of each other's dog and kids, and becoming friends, or at least knowing enough about each other's life for the reality to sink in. So the most important thing in any kind of storytelling is truth, and if you're going to write about Aboriginal people, you have to know the truth. That means if you've only had an Australian education, you don't know the truth, so therefore you have to go to the people. There are books you can read. You know, you can read Henry Reynolds, you can watch Rachel Perkins films, you can you know, look at the beautiful paintings of our people, learn their dance. You can read Marie Moncara, you can read Alexis Wright, Kim Scott. You can do all that as preparation. But eventually, the only people who can give you the authority are the people themselves. And if you're writing, people write to me a lot of the time saying, I'm writing a story about Coonamble. You know, is it okay if I do that? They're asking me. And I say, listen, I don't live anywhere near Coonamble. I know the story you're referring to, but you're honour bound to get in your car and go and visit those people. You know, don't try and get a box ticked. Do the hard yards. Go through the embarrassing torture of being treated like a white fella until you prove yourself. And, you know, some of our people can be hard, but then some of our people are very suspicious and have every right to be. So if you're, you know, squirming in a chair for a few meetings, well, so you bloody should. It's only recently that it is. It is represented in mainstream literature now because the country is ready to listen. We've been telling you stories for 230 years, and I think of all those wonderful people like the Mowbourne family who wrote letters to the Queen, they wrote letters to the Governor, letters to the policeman, letters to the magistrate. Beautiful prose. There's untold examples of them, mostly written by women, and they're just wonderful evocations of ambition, justice and fairness, but were ignored. And now, you know, for people like Anita Heiss and Jared Thomas and Marie Mumkara, people like that, it's an easier road. People like me, much easier road. Look, like I said, my first 20 books were totally ignored by mainstream Australia. Like I was writing in a kerosene can because it was going nowhere. But I wasn't necessarily writing for them. I was writing for my family. I was writing family stories. I wrote a book called Ocean, which is all about family. And when I went back and researched that book, I'd written the novel, but then I went and researched the history of my family. I was shocked. I was in tears, realising that the history matched the fiction so closely. So that must have been like someone was whispering to me, you know, tell a story about the seals, tell a story about the monk-birds. And the truth of it is so bloody close. Tell a story about a school teacher. I tell a story there about a school teacher and a duck pond. And Auntie Ida West told me that story. I didn't realise my family was involved in it. You know, like, I tell that story, oh, ha, 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 it's a funny story about ducks. And then I go back and years later and I go, it's my bloody family. That story's about my family. And I didn't know that had been torn from me. And the Aboriginal people suffer this all the time, that our families were stolen from us. Children were stolen from families, but families were stolen from children. Anyway, rock and roll. We can't, you know, we just got to get on. And Aboriginal people are very, very good at getting on. You know, we're here, we've survived. I'm so proud of the tenacity of our communities. I see it every day. Well, if you start writing a story and you know deep in your heart, deep in your brain, deep in your bowels that you're shamming the story, it'll be a dog. It has to be a dog because you're pulling the reins on the horse, you're trying to pull that, you're like a bad jockey, you're trying to lose the race, and it shows. That's why so much of Australian history is so badly written, because there's this self-judgment, self-editing going on in the voice, so that you're trying to, you know, skew the history to look bright and airy, you know, that Australia is the most wonderful egalitarian place on earth, when you know in your heart it's not true. But you're trying to present this facade to the world so that people like Jared Diamond, who read the history of Australia, believe it and come out with, you know, a really good writer like Diamond comes out with nonsense when he talks about Australia because he believes the history. But he should have noticed by the, you know, the way the history was written in such a turgid way that someone was lying. And, you know, if we write with truth, and this is what I say to young writers, just write the truth. Write the truth of your family. Don't try and make your family better than they are. Tell the good bits and the bad bits and liberate yourself so that you're not having to second guess. Read a lot, talk a lot to old people, be observant, watch every mannerism, you know, get on a train, just watch people. Don't stare at people, but watch people out of the corner of your eye, watch their mannerisms and wonder about them. Wonder about the great beauty of humanity and look at someone's manner, their clothes, their habits, and try and guess at their life. And you might be right, you might be wrong, but if you're watching closely, you'll be more right than wrong. And do it with compassion. I think, yeah, there's all kinds of advice depending on what kind of books you want to write, but I'm only interested in the way I see the world, you know. I appreciate other people's viewpoint, but I see the world as a place of battle where people are under siege, and you have to be compassionate because everyone's trying to deal with this monstrous problem of how to get through the world. And the way people do it is ingenious. Many people have failed, and failed spectacularly. And that'll make a good story too. Everyone is just battling, you know. Anyone who is living in a gilded life on a Pacific island beside the pool with martinis, it's a shit story. I hope people learn about their country. I hope they have compassion for Aboriginal people. And I hope they leave the book with a burning desire for justice. Working on a film for Dark Emu. I'm working on a kid's version of Dark Emu. Working on 2 novels about the nature of violence in the world. Light topic, you know, it'll be a pot boiler. I'm working on collecting a book of poetry for Mugabala, working on collecting a book of short stories for Black Ink. I've got 2 children's novels will come out next year. I'm working on a children's novel, teenage novel, adult novel, I don't know what it is, about my grandson, which I've been working on for a long time. And I've got another novel which I'm really looking forward to getting back to. Apart from that, just kicking stones.